In a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, a group of young white supremacists had claimed dominance over the streets. They believed their power came from their hate, using intimidation to control the town. Led by Jared, a brash, outspoken man in his late 20s, the gang often targeted black residents, and they'd made it their mission to keep outsiders, especially black people, feeling unwelcome. One rainy evening, a black man in his 50s walked into town, his heavy boots splashing against the wet pavement. His name was Harold King, a man who had served in the U.S. Army for over 2 decades. Now retired, he was back to visit his old hometown, where his mother still lived in a modest house. His life, full of unseen scars from years of service in foreign wars, had taught him one thing: always keep moving forward, no matter what. The moment Harold walked through the town's main street, Jared and his gang took notice. They had seen him from a distance, tall, broad-shouldered, walking with a steady, purposeful stride. They saw a target. It was another opportunity to flex their muscles and intimidate someone who didn't belong. "Hey!" Jared shouted, stepping in front of Harold. His voice was mocking, full of venom. "What's a black man doing around here?" "You lost, old man." Harold stopped in his tracks, his tired eyes meeting Jared's. His face, weathered and worn from years of hard living, remained calm. He had dealt with worse, far worse, and the hostility of some small-town gang was nothing compared to the things he had seen on the battlefield just passing through. Harold replied quietly, his voice like gravel. No harm in that. Jared wasn't satisfied with the answer. "You don't just pass through here. You either show respect or get out," he said, puffing out his chest as he advanced. The gang surrounded Harold, a circle of menacing faces, waiting for the first sign of weakness, but Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at each of them, his gaze piercing through their bravado. He had seen fear in the eyes of soldiers who had been in combat, and he could recognize the tremor in a man's soul when it was driven by insecurity. Jared pushed Harold's shoulder, the first of many taunts. "I don't like your kind here," he spat. Harold's eyes narrowed, but he didn't react with violence. Instead, he reached under his jacket and pulled out an old, weathered photograph. It was a picture of a group of soldiers, grinning despite the exhaustion in their eyes. Their uniforms were faded, and their faces were scarred, but they were standing together, a brotherhood. Harold held the picture up for Jared to see. "This is me," Harold began, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "This was taken during my second tour in Afghanistan. That man on the left, Sergeant Miller, he saved my life. And the man on the right, Private Johnson, he was the one who taught me everything about survival. Those men, they didn't care about my skin color. We cared about each other because we had to. We fought and bled for each other. That's what brotherhood is." Jared scoffed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Harold said, looking him directly in the eyes, "that I fought in wars where people were shooting at me, trying to take my life. I've watched my friends die in my arms. I've seen men from all over the world put aside everything, even their own prejudices, just to survive. We didn't care who was black, who was white, who was Muslim, or who was Christian. We cared about our mission. We cared about each other. So, when you look at me, when you think you can push me around, just remember, I fought real battles, not the kind you think you're fighting here for a long moment." Jared and his gang were silent. The weight of Harold's words hung in the air, thickening the tension. They had expected confrontation, maybe even violence, but instead, they were confronted with a man who had seen the world in ways they never would. The gang members, most of them young and inexperienced with real conflict, began to feel uneasy. Jared looked down at the ground, his bravado faltering. You fought for this country?" he muttered, unsure how to respond. It wasn't the answer he had expected. The picture of the Brotherhood of soldiers struck him like a fist to the gut. Harold nodded, his voice softer now. I fought for freedom, not just for one group of people, but for everyone, including you. There was no shouting, no fighting. Instead, the gang dispersed slowly, unsure of what to make of this encounter. They had come to bully, to impose their will, but in the face of a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, they felt small, ashamed, even as Harold turned to walk away. Jard called out to him, his voice quieter now, a note of regret in it. Sorry, man. I didn't know Harold didn't turn back. You didn't know, he said simply. And that's the problem. By the time Harold reached his mother's house, the echo of that moment still lingered in the air. Jared and his gang had learned a powerful lesson. Hate was an easy weapon, but it was one they could no longer wield without feeling the weight of their ignorance. In the days that followed, some of the gang members, particularly the younger ones, began questioning the beliefs they had clung to. They'd never understood what it meant to sacrifice, to put your life on the line for people who weren't your family, your race, or your kind. But now they saw a different side of humanity, one that had been forged in war and carried in silence. As for Harold, he never looked back. His past was his own, full of both pride and pain, and he had no desire to dwell on it. He simply wanted to live in peace, to honor the memory of his fallen brothers. But he knew deep down that sometimes peace came through confrontation, not of fists, but of truth. And that night, he had given the town a glimpse of it.